2025 has really been the year where I have fully become a reader. It was in January that I picked up the first book that I had read in quite a while. Since then, I just have not stopped reading. I have loved filming videos and bringing you along with me on BookTok as well as BookTube. So with that in mind today, I wanted to do a mid-year reading wrap-up, chatting through everything I've been reading and everything that I've been loving so far this year. I've found new genres that I've loved this year and also books that I know will be my favourite books for a long time, so I can't wait to chat through them all today. So if you're looking for new book recommendations or you just want to chat about the books that you've also been loving this year, then stick around, chat in the comments. It'll be really nice to chat through those books together. So far this year I've read 28 books. There's been romance and thrillers, contemporary fiction, historical fiction. So I feel like I've read a really good varied list of books. And the first book on that list was Blue Sisters by Coco Mellors. Blue Sisters follows three sisters, Avery, Bonnie and Lucky, a year after their sister Nikki has unexpectedly died. The three sisters are pretty different to one another, and from what I remember, Nikki was very much the glue that kind of held them together. A year after her death, the sisters find themselves back at their childhood apartment in New York, and they're there to try and stop the sale of the apartment. The book follows them navigating their own lives, their relationships with one another, and also their grief after losing their sister Nikki. When I originally read this book, and it's actually something that I'd really like to bring back to the reviews that I make about books at the moment, is I gave it a 3-word review, kind of a 3-word sum up of the feeling that the book gave me, and the 3 words that I chose for this one were heartbreaking, thought-provoking and moving. And I do feel like that does capture, in a way, or at least it captures my experience of the feeling of the book and the themes that were discussed throughout it. Something I really enjoyed about this book was the structure. It was split up by each of the sisters' perspectives, and we also flicked between modern day and back in time as well. In the modern day perspective, we very much stayed in a similar time frame. I feel like it was maybe a couple of days or at tops a couple of weeks that we stayed in. I think that worked really well for getting a really deep understanding of the characters at that time. Alongside that though, like I said, we flicked back in time, and the back in time timeline was definitely quite fast paced. It not only gave really good context to what they're experiencing in modern day, but because it had that quicker pace, it meant that the book overall didn't necessarily feel slow paced, with modern day being in that small timeline because it was broken up with flicking back in time. So I just think the structure worked really well. I also thought it worked really well that we followed 3 characters, because it really showed how different people handle similar situations in very different ways, and I felt like that was a really effective thing to show through this book. There's so much more to say about this book, but overall I gave this one 4 out of 5 stars. The next book I read this year is The Pumpkin Spice Cafe by Laurie Gilmore. This book came highly recommended on BookTok, and being new to the BookTok community at the time, I was so excited to read a book that I was seeing everywhere. This book is the first book in the Dream Harbour series, and it follows Jeannie, who is the new girl in a New England town, and she's there to run her aunt's cafe, the Pumpkin Spice Cafe. The story follows her experience in the new town, and more specifically it looks at her relationship with local farmer Logan. If you love Gilmore Girls, this book is definitely one that I would recommend reading. It very much has those Gilmore Girls vibes, and I even feel like the personalities of Jeannie and Logan are very much similar to Lorelai and Luke. The town itself also feels very much like Stellar's Hollow, and so for me as a Gilmore Girls fan, it just had that really cozy, familiar feel to it. I also found this book a very easy and pretty quick read, and I also remember saying in the review that I made on BookTok at the time that if you're new to reading and you're looking for a romance book to start with, that this one would be a really great one to go to. This is also the first book that I tried immersive reading with, which has become such a part of my reading experience that I absolutely love. Immersive reading, for those of you who might not have come across it before, is where you combine listening to the audiobook whilst at the same time reading the physical copy. And I really enjoyed that experience with this book. It really, like when I do it with most books, it really gave me such a sense of the characters' personalities really early on in the book, which I really enjoyed. In this book, we flicked between the two main characters' perspectives. So I think because of that, personally, I might have preferred if it was written in first person as opposed to third person, just because maybe it might have helped the book flow a little bit more, and it might have helped me to connect even more with the characters. But because I did find it a nice read, it didn't affect my experience too much, and I decided to give this book 3.5 stars. Next, I carried on with the BookTok recommended series, and I picked up Magnolia Parks by Jessa Hastings. I saw this book described before I read it as Gossip Girl meets Made in Chelsea, and having read it, I feel like that was a good description of the feeling throughout this one. It follows Magnolia Parks, who is London's most famous socialite, and her very much up and down relationship with BJ. It also looks at her life and her friendship group, and this book is written from Magnolia's and from BJ's perspective. I loved with this one how at the beginning of the book the characters were almost quite frustrating but by the end of the book and as the plot developed, I kind of had a little bit more of an understanding of their decision making as a whole. So even when I didn't necessarily agree with what they chose to do or the things that they said or anything like that, I really was able to understand why they might have done that and just understand the characters' thought processes themselves. And I think that's because it was really well written, that kind of unpicking of the characters throughout the plot. So they definitely made a bit more sense to me by the end of the book. This is also the book that 100% confirmed my love of immersive reading, because it really did add so much to the experience, this one, particularly in Magnolia's perspective. I felt like I really got who she was as a character and her personality. I remember when I was rating this book, I was pretty consistent throughout the book in thinking that I would give it 4.5 stars, but then I got to the last couple of chapters of the book, and if you've read it, you'll know which part I'm talking about, and I immediately shifted that rating to 5 stars because it was such a great ending. It made me really want to read more of Magnolia and BJ's story and also read more books in the series. So having said that, it was straight onto book 2 of the series for me, and next I picked up Daisy Hates by Jessa Hastings. This book shifts from focusing on Magnolia and focuses on Daisy Hates. It focuses on her as she navigates loss and her love life, and also being the sister to the leader of a gang in London. It's written from 3 different perspectives, the characters Christian, Julian and Daisy. And I would say that this book, even though it's very much set in the same world and the same friendship group as the first book, it shifts a little bit from feeling like Made in Chelsea and Gossip Girl because of those new themes that are introduced. Something I really loved about this book was that it happened in the same timeline as book 1, and so I felt like it filled in gaps that I didn't even know were there in book 1, and I really enjoyed hearing other people's perspectives on those situations. Something else that I remember writing about in my review at the time was the addition of footnotes in this book, which was a really interesting reading experience. The footnotes were essentially in addition to what the characters were saying, so a sentence would be written from their perspective in the main text, and then you'd be directed to the footnotes, and that footnote tended to add their inner thoughts about what they were saying. So you basically got a bit of a deeper look at the characters through those footnotes. So I did like that we were given those extra pieces of information, and there were also some funny bits added. I just found at times those footnotes were a little bit distracting when I was having to leave that main body and go to the footnote and then go back to the main body of the text. So I really liked the writing and what we were given in those footnotes. I just feel like sometimes it was difficult for that structure to flow whilst I was reading it. So overall, I gave this book 4 stars. The characters were great. I found the themes really interesting that were discussed, but it was just those footnotes that I still can't quite decide how I felt about them, which is why I'm giving it 4 stars and not 5. For my next read, I really wanted to mix up the genres that I've been reading and try something new, so I decided to pick up a thriller, which was The Woman Who Lied by Claire Douglas. This book is based around a crime writer in London who begins to experience some of the things that have happened in her book in her real life, and things take a little bit more of a sinister turn when she begins to experience things in a book she is yet to release. From that point it becomes a very tense and twisty, turny read. The book is again written from different perspectives, so you're kind of chopping and changing between those perspectives throughout the whole book. And because this is a mystery, I really feel like this structure worked very well, and it's actually become, since I've read more and more thrillers, one of my favourite ways that a mystery book is structured. Pretty much every chapter ends on a cliffhanger, and so the fact that we chopped and changed so much made me just want to keep turning the page and kind of getting back to the perspective that had just had a twist, and also getting to the perspective where I was wanting to see what had happened in that twist, if that makes sense. I also really liked how many twists and turns there were throughout the whole book, and how it kind of felt a bit like a whodunit, and I think it's a sign of a good thriller where at some point in the book I was very much suspecting pretty much everyone, and that really is down to that good writing. This was another one where initially when I was writing the review I was thinking of giving it 4.5 stars, but the more I wrote and the more I thought about it, I realised that I really didn't have anything negative to say at all about this book, so I very quickly changed that thought into 5 stars. Next, to continue my new love of thrillers, I decided to pick up The Crash by Freida McFadden. I actually headed to the bookshop looking for The Housemaid by Freida McFadden, but I came across this one first and the plotline of it really intrigued me. This one follows Tegan, who is 8 months pregnant, and she finds herself in a situation that she very much did not see coming after she is rescued by a couple following getting into a car accident. I feel like this book definitely started off really well. There were some pretty big plot points that happened right in the first couple of chapters, and so it made me really excited to read more because I felt like that fast pace was going to keep up throughout the whole book, and that's something that I now really enjoy about thrillers, when that fast pace happens from basically chapter 1 and just continues throughout the whole book. So I was really looking forward to that because that's what I thought that this book was going to be. But what I would say is that the story and the pace definitely slowed down a little bit towards the middle section of this book. There wasn't kind of a lot of movement in the middle sections, and it's probably because that middle part of the book basically took place pretty much in the same place. And so maybe it was just that there was only kind of so much to explore in that space. And so because of that, I didn't feel like the middle chapters in the book kept me as hooked as the first couple of chapters. But I would say that it definitely picked up again towards the end, and there were a few pretty big twists that I really did not see coming towards the end of the book. I gave this book 3 stars. I remember saying at the time that I was reviewing it that I would definitely like to read Freida McFadden's other books because I think I would really enjoy them. It might just be the case that this one won't necessarily be my favourite one from her. Next book was the first book that I decided to read from the Rory Gilmore reading list, which is a list I am slowly making my way through at the moment, and that was Little Women by Louisa May Alcott. For those of you who might not be familiar, Little Women follows 4 sisters, essentially as they're leaving childhood and entering adulthood. It follows their relationships, their careers, their sisterhood, and their differing experiences at the time. As a fan of Greta Gerwig's 2019 film adaptation of Little Women, this book was such a great read for me. I loved seeing how each of the characters were originally written in the book and how that had been adapted to the screen. It was great to see that a lot of the lines in the film were as they were originally written, and it was also nice to read new lines from the characters that might not have made it into the film, because it was just seeing a new part of characters that I really love. I loved also the writing style of this book. The emotions that the characters were feeling were really beautifully written and just so well described. And even though this was written in 1868, the emotions that were written are ones that you could really relate to, and I think that is all down to the writing style. I also really loved the time span that this book covered. It's something that I really love about the film as well. Alongside that writing style, it just makes you feel like you get that deeper sense of the characters, which I always enjoy joy when reading a book. And another thing that I loved in terms of the writing itself and the themes that were discussed was how everyday moments were written. It felt like those everyday moments were the lovely and special moments throughout this book, which is something that I felt like was a really nice reminder and really lovely. I gave this book 5 stars. It was such a brilliant read, and because I love the story so much through having loved the film, it kind of felt like almost a nostalgic read for me in a way that I really enjoyed. Next up is The Couple at Number 9 by Claire Douglas, which if you follow me on Book Talk, you will have likely heard me talking about this one. The Couple at Number 9 follows Safi and Tom as they move into Safi's grandmother's house after Safi's grandmother has moved into a care home having been diagnosed with Alzheimer's. And things very quickly take a turn in this book when builders who are working in the garden of the house find 2 bodies buried there. I just did not see the twists and turns in this book coming. And something that I really enjoyed about this book, which I wouldn't necessarily always enjoy, but I just really did with this one, is that not only did we flick between perspectives of the characters, in those perspectives themselves we also flicked between first person and third person, and in one of the perspectives one of the characters was also talking to another of the characters. So there was a lot happening in terms of perspectives that we were experiencing throughout this book. The reason I think I enjoyed that so much was because I felt like it added to that choppiness that I think I mentioned earlier works really well for me when reading a thriller. It just added to the intrigue so much and the feeling of suspense and kind of not knowing what to expect. It added into all of that. So it was a bit of a surprise for me that I definitely really did enjoy that part of this book. Another thing that I really loved about this book is that right from chapter 1 the plot was moving forwards and it continued to twist and turn throughout the entire book. This is, I've come to learn, my favourite type of thriller, and it was also great because not only was the plot moving really quickly throughout, but the character building that was happening alongside that plot building, which I think works really well in a more fast-paced thriller. I gave this book 5 stars, and I'm sure I've said it before either here or on my book talk. The point that I realised that I wanted to give this book 5 stars was when I read a pretty major twist in this book and I had to reread it to make sure that I'd read it right because it was so well written. From that point forward I knew it was a 5-star read for me. So if you're looking for a thriller, I think this might be my top recommendation. Next I switched up the genres from thrillers and I picked up another book series that I'd seen recommended, Wild Love by Elsie Silver, which is the first book in the Rosehill series. Wild Love is written from the perspective of our 2 main characters, Rosie and Ford. For different reasons, both find themselves moving back to the town that they grew up in, Rosehill, and they reconnect over their shared history and where they find themselves in life at the moment. What I really liked about this book is that I found Ford and Rosie's relationship perfectly paced. I think it's because they knew each other growing up. It didn't feel rushed at all throughout the book. I also found Ford really funny. He had such a dry sense of humour that was definitely brought out a little bit more through one particular plot line in the book. It just really made him such a warm and likeable character, that sense of humour. There are a few things that I tried in this book that if you're going to read this one, I would definitely recommend. The first, probably unsurprisingly at this point in the video, is immersive reading. I love listening to an audiobook when the book is written from 2 different perspectives, and it was really nice to experience that with this book. Also, book annotating. This was the first sort of full book that I had properly annotated throughout reading it. It's really nice, not only in the moment to kind of stop and annotate that line and be on the lookout for lines that you really like for different reasons, whether it's that they're really well written or whether they're funny or whatever it might be, but also it's really nice to be able to look back through the book after I have finished reading it now and see which lines stood out to me at the time that I read it. A side character that I really liked throughout this book was West, who was Rosie's brother, and part of me at the time of reading it wished that we'd heard a little bit more from him because he was really pretty central to the plot and mainly to Rosie and Ford's relationship. I now know, having read the second book in the series, that the second book focuses on West, so that's probably why he wasn't discussed so much in the first book, but at the time that I read this I definitely wish we'd heard a little bit more from him. I gave this book 4 stars. It was a really easy, enjoyable read, and I actually think it would be a really good holiday read. Next, I picked up The Burnout by Sophie Kinsella. This book follows Sasha, who is burnt out at work and takes an extended leave where she goes on holiday to a place that she loves as a child, and while she's there she meets Finn. The book follows her figuring out what she wants to do with her life in terms of mainly her career and also her dynamic with Finn. I really enjoyed the humour in this book, particularly the first half. I annotated so many funny moments, and in my review I noted down chapter 2 as being one that really made me laugh, and even having read over my review that I wrote at the time, I know exactly what that is referring to because I found it such a funny chapter to read. I just found Sasha really funny. I felt like she had a really dry sense of humour that added a lot to her character throughout the book, and it really felt like you got to know her personality pretty early on because of that. I also really enjoyed the pacing of Sasha and Finn's dynamic and relationship developing. I liked how the more time that they spent together, the more they realised that they had in common, and that's what brought them closer together. It made their relationship develop in a way that felt really natural. I rated this book 3.5 stars. It was a really easy, lovely read, and I would definitely recommend if you're looking for a romance that has a really funny and also really nostalgic main character, this would be a really good one for you. I then decided to read Picking Daisies on Sundays by Liana Cincotti. This book follows Danny, also known as Daisy, and Levi. It's been 4 years since they've seen each other and 4 years since Danny admitted her feelings to Levi, who was her best friend at the time. They bump into each other all those years later, and one way or another Danny finds herself agreeing to pretend to be in a relationship with Levi and go to his sister's wedding with him. I loved the way that this book was structured so much. It felt like there were clues put in along the way that, now that I've read the whole book, were definitely a little bit of foreshadowing for a certain moment in the book where everything came together. And it's actually kind of one that I'm pretty sure next spring I will reread, not only because it's a perfect spring read, but also because now that I know that that happens and everything kind of pieces itself together, I think I would really enjoy the reread. I also remember saying that I felt very complete when I finished reading this book in my review. I felt like all my questions had been answered, everything that I would have wanted to see in this book was very much there, and that included an epilogue, which is an aspect of a book that I always absolutely love, both a prologue and an epilogue. Also, if you're a fan of Taylor Swift like I am, I would definitely recommend reading this book because there are a couple of Taylor Swift references throughout, which is really fun. So I gave this book 4.5 stars. If you haven't read it, I would really recommend. It's got all the lovely rom-com vibes and a really good plot too. Okay, next up is Ready or Not by Cara Bastone. This book follows Eve as she unexpectedly finds out that she's pregnant, and it follows her through each of her trimesters in her pregnancy. It looks at her friendships throughout the book, her relationships as well, and of course her experience with pregnancy. I've never read a book that is centered around pregnancy before, and I felt like I really loved how pregnancy was described throughout this book. It was very open, very honest, and because of that it felt like a really insightful look at pregnancy in general, and more specifically Eve's experience of pregnancy, and I really enjoyed that aspect of it because, like I said, I've not really read a book that centres around that before. I also really liked the personality of our main love interest in this book and his dynamic with Eve. I loved as well that it wasn't necessarily who you'd expect being the main love interest of this book. It added a more real element to it, which I think went really well with that real and honest approach to discussing pregnancy and discussing other themes throughout this book as well. I felt like emotions and dynamics were written in a really great way throughout that book, very much in that insightful way, and so I decided to give this book 4 stars. For my next book, I decided to head back to the thriller genre and I picked up No One Saw a Thing by Andrea Mara. This book follows Sive, who, while she is getting on a busy London tube, tells her daughters, who are pretty young at the time, to run ahead and get onto the tube, and essentially they make it onto the tube and she doesn't. With the help of some strangers around her at the time, she finds that her daughters will be waiting for her at the next stop, but when she gets there, only one one of her daughters is there. They are in London for her husband's friendship reunion, so that is also the backdrop of the weekend. One thing that I really wanted to say about this book is that I absolutely loved the timelines, the fact that it took place in 2 different timelines. So one of the timelines was moment by moment when Sive's daughter went missing, and the other timeline was a couple of days before at the reunion with her husband's friends. And what was great about that is that the timeline with the friends gave really good context for what was happening in the other timeline, and then the other timeline gave that sense of urgency that I think makes a really good thriller. So that combined overall just added so much to the book. So I felt like the structure in this book was so effective. I also just really loved how fast-paced this book was from the start. I really loved it. It's a thriller that I've actually recommended and given to a couple of people to read because I think a lot of people would enjoy this one because it is that fast-paced right from the beginning. It was just such a page turner, really enjoyed it, and I gave it 4.5 stars. I think also I remember saying that the only reason I didn't give it 5 stars at the time was that I compare every thriller I now read to my experience with The Couple at Number 9, so probably worth saying that it probably would have been a 5-star if I hadn't have read The Couple at Number 9. And maybe when I look back through all my books this year and think about everything that I've read, I might change this rating, but for now I'll stick with what I said at the time and give it 4.5 stars. Whenever I read one thriller, I tend to read another one straight after because I just seem to really get into this genre and want to read more. So the next book I read was also a thriller, and it was The Wrong Sister by Claire Douglas. This book follows Alice and Tasha. Tasha goes on holiday and leaves her children in the care of Alice and her husband, who is called Kyle. A few nights into her trip away, she gets a phone call to say that Kyle and Alice have been attacked. Tasha is in hospital and Kyle has died, and it's from there that we figure out exactly what happened in that moment. This book definitely felt a little bit more slow-paced than the other Claire Douglas books that I had read. It's very much more of a slow build thriller, or that's what it felt like for me reading it at the time. It probably had something to do with the fact that I just finished reading such a fast-paced thriller that it felt quite so slow-paced. If you like that more slow-paced book, I would still really recommend this one because it still had that Claire Douglas writing style when the twists and turns happened in the book. I think for me personally, I've just realised that on the whole, other than a book that I'm going to mention later, on the whole, I generally really enjoy that more fast-paced thriller. So because of that, I gave this book 3 stars, but it definitely was still an enjoyable read. It was just my personal experience, which is why I gave it 3 stars. Earlier in the year, when I'd finished reading Wild Love, I was really keen to carry on reading the series. So the next book that I picked up was the second book in the Rosehill series. It was Wild Eyes by Elsie Silver. Wild Eyes follows famous country singer Sky, who after experiencing some bad press goes to Rosehill, and it's there that she ends up meeting her main love interest, who is West, the side character from the first book that I really liked. I really loved the dynamic between West and Sky. Even though they had pretty much instantly a more than friends dynamic between them, it didn't feel rushed at all, and I think that's just because their dynamic was written in such a natural way. It was also, even though it had an element of sadness to it, really lovely seeing Sky experience a level of kindness and genuineness from West that she hadn't necessarily experienced before, or certainly hadn't experienced recently. So that was a really lovely part of their dynamic. Another part of their dynamic that was lovely, now that I'm thinking about it, is the addition of West's children. It was lovely to see their relationship and their closeness with Sky, and I think all of those elements that I have mentioned about their relationship, or both, have I just mentioned 2 parts of their relationship? Maybe. But those elements are what made it feel not rushed and what made it feel really natural. I would say I did feel like the plot slowed a little bit in the middle section of the book, but it definitely picked up again towards the end, so it didn't matter too much to my overall reading experience, but there were definitely a few chapters in the middle there where it felt a little bit slower. I gave the first book in the series 4 stars, and I think I'd rate this one 3.5. Next on my list is an author that I had been really wanting to read a book book from for a little while at this point, and that is Emily Henry. I picked up the book Great Big Beautiful Life from her, which is a new release this year. This book follows Alice and Hayden, who are two writers competing to write the story of the famous Margaret Ives, who hasn't been seen in years. That is the central plot of the book, but in terms of the perspectives that we follow, we look at Alice in modern day and we then flick back in time to look at Margaret. And I think because you had those two perspectives and because of the way that it was written, that's why you were able to look at so many themes throughout this book. I also really liked the character development in this book and the unpicking of the main characters throughout it. We not only got a real sense of who our characters are, but we also, as the book developed, got a real sense of why and what led them to doing certain things and feeling certain ways. So whether that was Alice or Margaret or Hayden as well, actually, by the end of the book I just felt like I really knew the characters, and that I feel always makes it really good when you're reading a book where you feel you really understand the characters, because then when something pretty big happens you can kind of understand their reactions a little bit more. I would also say that if you love The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo by Taylor Jenkins Reid, which is a book that I absolutely loved, then you would really enjoy this one. It had a similar feel to it because both books explore somebody being there to write somebody else's story. So both books have that kind of similar layout, and even though the books are different from one another, if you like that structure and you like that kind of plot point, I think you would really enjoy both books. In terms of rating this book, it was a very easy 5-star read for me. Next was the first historical fiction that I had ever read. I was really wanting to switch up genres, try something new, and I decided to go for historical fiction. So the book that I picked up was The Nightingale by Kristen Hanna. There is so much depth to this book, so it really is quite hard to give a summary at all because I feel like so much happens and is discussed in this book. But essentially we follow two sisters at the time of World War II in France, at the time where Germany invaded. And we basically look at how these sisters' experiences differ and what made those experiences different. It's such an insightful book with so much depth, so that summary doesn't do the book justice or the themes that are discussed in the book justice at all. But just for a brief summary, that is an overview of what the book is about. As I said, it's the first historical fiction book that I have ever read, and it just felt like it was so well researched. I felt like I learned so much throughout reading this book that I didn't know before, and even though it's obviously a fiction book, there were so many takeaways from reading it, particularly when it came to women's experience in the war, specifically of course their experience in France. It was a very emotional read, and it's a book that I have already lent out again. I feel like it's always a good sign of a good book when you're lending it out to other people, and this one was one of those. I gave this book 5 stars. It was great actually. I had 2 books at the time that were 5 stars, which I think is really nice to read such great books in such a short amount of time. My next read was Fragile Sanctuary by Catherine Cowles, and this had a plot that I just was not expecting going into it. This book follows Rose, who is rebuilding her family home after a difficult past, and it also follows her relationship alongside that with Anson, who is her brother's best friend and is also working on the rebuilding of her family home. What I didn't expect about this book and the plot points was the mysterious element in this book, and it almost felt like a thriller at times alongside being a romance, which as a thriller fan now I really enjoyed. One thing I would say about this book is that there were quite a lot of characters throughout the book, so at times, particularly at the beginning of the book, I maybe found it a little bit difficult to follow and to get in my mind who was who and everybody's relationships to one another. But ultimately, when I reflect on the book now, it probably did add quite a lot to that mysterious element. So it wasn't necessarily a bad thing or a criticism, it was just that it took me a minute to get used to the amount of characters that were introduced throughout the book. The dynamics between Anson and Rhodes were great throughout this book. It was another one where their relationship developed very much alongside the plot moving forwards, which, as I mentioned earlier, I really enjoy. I decided to give this book 3.75 stars, and also this book was gifted to me from Evermore Books, so thank you very much for Evermore Books for gifting me that. that. It was the first book I've ever been gifted and I was so grateful for it. It was so exciting and it still is. So thank you very much. After having been on my TBR for quite a while, I finally picked up The Housemaid by Frida McFadden. The Housemaid follows Millie, who gets a job with the Winchester family as a live-in housemaid. The Winchesters are a very wealthy family, and when she turns up to the house, suspicious things start happening, particularly with one member of the family. And I read this book so quickly, and I don't think that's because I'm a particularly fast reader or anything like that. I just think I found it so gripping that I really could not put it down, so I read it so fast. Another reason I felt like I kept turning the page was because the chapters were a really great length. They were relatively short and something different was happening in seemingly every chapter, so it just made for such a gripping read. I was also really intrigued by a few of the characters' actions in the book. I won't say which ones in case you haven't read it yet, but I was really intrigued by what was going on and why they were acting in certain ways. So trying to understand the characters definitely kept me reading as well. The structure of this book was great. It was another one where we flicked between perspectives, which, as I've said a couple of times this video, is something that I really enjoy. And I don't really want to say how, just in case it's a spoiler, but the book is also separated out in a way that really adds to those moments of twists and turns. I would say that there weren't as many twists towards the end of the book as I expected. Just because it had been such a twisty-turny book throughout, I maybe expected a few more twists and turns towards the end, but it didn't necessarily matter too much because I had found it such a gripping read. And there was also a prologue and an epilogue, which is always a plus for me. I decided to give this book 4 stars. Now I headed back to my Rory Gilmore reading list and I picked up And Then There Were None by Agatha Christie. This book follows 10 strangers who are invited under various reasons to Soldier Island. They are cut off from the mainland and slowly but surely realise that things aren't going to be quite as each of them had imagined with their stay on the island. One thing that I found difficult throughout this book, which is something that I also mentioned for Fragile Sanctuary, was the amount of characters that were in this book, particularly at the beginning. I think I just found it difficult to understand who everybody was, keep in mind the backstory of all of the characters, because the characters before arriving on Soldier Island weren't necessarily connected to one another, so each of them had different contexts to remember. So I think I just found it a little bit difficult to remember the backstory of everyone. As the story went on, that definitely got a bit easier. The vibe of this book essentially became a bit of a whodunit, as you'd expect with Agatha Christie. When I was following each of the characters' lines of thoughts, because their thoughts were so well written, it meant that I was also suspecting the characters that they were at the time. And that was a really fun part of the reading experience actually, because it felt like not only was I, as the reader, suspecting characters, but I was suspecting them alongside different people within the book. So it was quite a good experience in that way. I rated this book 3 stars. I don't necessarily feel like it was my favourite mysterious kind of thriller book that I've ever read, but it was definitely well written. For my next read, I decided to pick up Normal People by Sally Rooney. This book follows Marianne and Connell and their relationship from school to uni and to just after they have finished uni. Being a fan of the series, I love how much of a nostalgic read this was for me, in the same way that Little Women was a nostalgic read as well. It just felt like I was revisiting characters that I know and love. I loved seeing how true to the book the series was, reading a few new moments between our characters, whether that be the characters' inner thoughts or a conversation that might not have made it into the series. I just really liked that aspect of it as a fan of the series. It was also such a beautifully written book. It was such an honest look at Marianne and Connell's relationship, and there were so many well-written lines throughout this book that summarised what they were feeling and were written in a way that were either really relatable or made you feel like you fully understood the characters. I also read this one before I went on a trip to Ireland, so I felt like I read it at the perfect time for me. I absolutely loved it, and unsurprisingly it was a 5-star read. Next up was a recommendation from my cousin after our trip to Ireland. It was Carla by Colin Walsh. Carla follows 3 friends friends who are back in the seaside town of Kinlow in Ireland. It's been years since they've seen each other and years since their friend Carla went missing. The book is written from each of their perspectives, and we look at what happened to Carla, and also we look at modern day and them reuniting in their hometown. One thing that was notable in this book was the pacing. I feel like the last third of the book was where the pace of it definitely picked up. It felt like the first 2/3 of the book were very much focused on understanding the characters and kind of learning about their dynamics with one another, so that when the pace did pick up in that third part of the book, you really understood how the characters might feel at that point. So the pace definitely worked in that way. I probably personally would have preferred if the pace was a little bit more evenly spread throughout the whole book. I really enjoyed the writing style of this book. It was another one that felt really beautifully written. We kind of look at a coming of age theme within our characters' storylines, and I felt like that theme in particular was really well written. I was a little confused by the ending of the book, which I obviously won't say too much about, but it did leave me with a few questions, and I still think I'm yet to figure out how I feel about the ending, and that's how I felt at the time of reading it. I decided to give this book 3.5 stars, and I believe this was Colin Walsh's debut novel, so it'll be interesting to read some more from him when they're released. Next up, another one by one of my favourite authors, Claire Douglas. It is The Girls Who Disappeared. This tells the story of a car accident that happened 20 years ago, where 3 teenage girls vanished, leaving only Olivia behind. I just could not put this book down. I was intrigued by it so much. As always with Claire Douglas, the way that she pieces together stories and leaves clues along the way really does just keep me hooked. I just love those kind of thrillers where you're picking up clues and pieces of information and trying to figure out what is happening along the way. And then often, even when you think you've figured it out, a big twist comes in and surprises you completely. I just really love that style of thrillers, and this one was definitely like that. I also really liked the gothic atmosphere that was created when reading this book. The town that this book was set in had old tales that were a bit haunted, and that definitely gave that gothic aspect. I do feel like those old tales that were told of the town might have been a little bit more relevant to the plot itself and the kind of figuring out what happened to the girls. So overall, I gave this book 4 stars. I definitely feel like Claire Douglas is a really reliable author for me. I really enjoy her writing style and the way that she writes twists and turns, and I definitely felt the same about the twists and turns in this book. Over on my book talk at this point in the past couple of months, I asked for some series recommendations. I was really keen to find a series that was different to any series that I had been reading up until then, and the series that was recommended to me was Once Upon a Broken Heart series by Stephanie Garber, and the first book is called Once Upon a Broken Heart. This book follows Evangeline Fox, who makes a deal that she may come to regret after finding out that the love of her life plans to marry her stepsister, and this decision leads her down a very twisty, turny path. I really enjoyed the characters themselves in this book. I felt like they were so well written, and they seem to have really unique personalities. Particularly the character Jax had a really unique personality throughout the book, and because of how the characters were a little bit unpredictable and because of the writing within this book, it felt like alongside Evangeline we were, as the reader, figuring out who we could trust and who we couldn't, and that meant that when the twists and turns happened throughout the book, they were often quite surprising or a little bit unexpected. I also really loved the magic element in this book. It was written in a way that was really easy to understand, and it felt like the world that the book was set in really came to life through that magic element. And having said that, I feel like the world building in general in this book was really, really well done, because I felt really immersed in this book and in this world whilst I was reading. Another thing that I really enjoyed about the magic element of the book was that it meant that the plot points were quite hard to predict, which again added to that element of surprise, because as the reader alongside Evangeline didn't necessarily know all of the magic aspects of the world, it meant that the plot was quite hard to predict, which made for a really good read and some really gripping twists and turns. I absolutely loved this book and I rated it 5 stars. It was a great recommendation. It was actually the first fantasy book that I have ever read completely start to finish, and I just really enjoyed it. So because I enjoyed it so much, much, I went straight on to the second book in the series, which follows straight on to where the story ended in book 1. And once I finished reading this book, I realised how much I just absolutely loved this series. And because this book picks up right from where the first book left off, and because I read them one after another, I felt so connected to the characters immediately from page 1 and so invested in what was going to happen next. It was fast-paced, there was a brilliant plot throughout the whole book. It was really filled with plot actually, just so much was going on, and that made for such a good read. I also loved the characters' relationship developments throughout this book. There was so much happening in terms of the development of certain relationships that obviously I won't say in case you haven't read either book in the series, but when it came to certain relationships there were some pretty big developments and it was really great to read. So I can't wait for book 3. I'm still yet to read it, and unsurprisingly I gave this book 5 stars as well. And now that I was on a roll of reading series, I decided to dip back into another series and read The Cinnamon Bun Bookstore by Laurie Gilmore, which is the second book after the Pumpkin Spice Cafe in the Dream Harbour series. This book follows Noah and Hazel. Hazel runs the Cinnamon Bun Bookstore. She is just about to turn 30 and feeling like she maybe hasn't had the fun in her 20s that she maybe would have wanted. So when secret codes and clues start to turn up in some of the books in her bookstore, she decides alongside Noah to follow the clues. She has the aim of making the summer before her 30th birthday a really fun one, in a similar way to the second book in the Once Upon a Broken Heart series. Because this was the second book in a series, I immediately felt really connected and immersed in the world that it was set in, and I loved the fact that certain characters from the first book revisited us in the second. It just all felt quite familiar in a way that was really lovely, and because of that, that Gilmore Girls vibe definitely carried through into book 2. I would say that this book and the series in general is a bit more mature than Gilmore Girls, but it definitely has that vibe as its backdrop. Our main two characters had a great dynamic with each other. I would say that it was maybe a little bit quick off the mark at the beginning of the book, in that their dynamic developed at a really fast pace. I think it maybe might have made a little bit more sense if we'd taken a little bit of a longer time to build that dynamic. It just maybe might have felt a little bit more natural to read, but ultimately I did enjoy their dynamic. I also really liked the clue and the code aspect of this book. It felt like the plot was really moving forward. I was really interested in what was going on with these clues. Why were they being left? Who were they being left by? What was going on? And so I really liked that aspect of this one. And I decided to rate the book 3.5 stars. Next is another one that had been on my TBR for quite a while, because it's one that I had seen recommended very highly on Book Talk, and a lot of people said it was the perfect summer read. So now that it was June at this time, I decided to pick up The 7-Year Slip by Ashley Poston. So this follows Clementine, who after inheriting her aunt's apartment, she finds that the apartment has a magic element to it in that it can travel in time by exactly 7 years. So when Iwan shows up at the apartment, Clementine realises that he is 7 years in the past, and we read their dynamic develop and what this 7-year slip does in terms of the impact on their relationship and their dynamic. I really loved how this book explored so many different things. It looked at friendship and career and loss and relationships. I felt like it was another one that really took care over the themes that were discussed throughout the book, and it was a really honest and open look at how Clementine was feeling throughout. I just felt like it was really well written in that way. It maybe took me a little minute to connect with our main characters at the beginning of this book. I'm not entirely sure why. I think it just took me a minute to get into their dynamic, but by the second half of the book, maybe even the final 2/3 of the book, I really did enjoy their dynamic, and I enjoyed how the past and present were intertwined within this book. I think maybe it was the magic element. It took me a minute to get into that, but once I was into that, I was very much invested in seeing what happened. I gave this book 3.5 stars. It was definitely an enjoyable read, and I'm glad it was recommended to me. Now that I was into the swing of a summer read, I really wanted to read another summer book, but I was on the search for a summer thriller because I fancied also reading a thriller now that it is a real favourite genre of mine. So I came across The Perfect Couple by Ellen Hildebrand. This book centres around a lavish wedding in Nantucket between Amelia and Benji, and on the morning of the wedding the maid of honour is found by the bride on the beach and she has died. The book focuses on the investigation that follows. It also flashes back in time to pre-wedding weekend and also the day before the wedding itself to give some context to the investigation. And throughout that investigation, family secrets are uncovered between mainly Benji's side of the family, who are the Winbury family. Now earlier I mentioned that there was a book that I read that was a little bit more character driven and character focused that I really enjoyed, where I might not usually with a thriller. And this book was that book. I just loved how much of a deep dive we did into the characters. I think because I had the time to read. In fact, I have filmed my whole reading experience on a previous video that I'll link in the description if you want my full thoughts on this one. It just felt like I was really fascinated by the characters. I was so intrigued by them, so I really liked that we looked more at them individually and the secrets that they had. It made the twists and turns so good because a lot of the twists and turns were about those secrets. I just really enjoyed the character driven nature of this book. I also loved the structure. It had that kind of jumpy structure where we were going from past and present to looking at different characters, and that really kept me on my toes, kept me turning the page and made for a really gripping read. I also mentioned in my recent video where I read this book that I found the ending a little bit confusing, or not necessarily confusing, I understood it, I was maybe confused by my feelings towards it. I'm not sure how I feel about it, and I'm still not quite sure about how I feel about it. If you've read this book, actually I would really love to know what you thought about the ending. I decided to ultimately give this book 4 stars. I really enjoyed enjoying a character focused and a character driven thriller. It was a different experience for me, and this book was also a Netflix series, so I was able to watch the series after having read the book, which was again a new and fun experience for me that I really enjoyed. So that is everything for my mid-year reading wrap up. Thank you so much for joining me to chat about the books I've been reading. It's been so fun to sit and chat. I think this will be a long video, or will have been a long video, so I hope you enjoyed sitting and chatting with me, and I would really love to know what you've been reading this year. What have your favourite reads of the year been? Do let me know, and let me know any recommendations that you've picked up along the way, because I'm always keen to find new recommendations. I feel like some of my favourite books have come from recommendations this year, so do let me know. And thank you very much for joining me. I will see you very soon with a new video.